We're going to get started now. Welcome, everyone. My name is Ariel Green, and I'm a member of the organizing committee for the Lander Climate Action Network. Thank you for coming to the Wyoming Climate Summit, and thank you for dedicating time and attention today to thinking more about climate change. Everyone has heard plenty of words about climate change, and yet I still think we're greatly underestimating how much it will impact our lives here in Wyoming. I agree with Governor Mark Gordon, who said 2 years ago in remarks before the Wyoming Press Association that he agreed that climate change is the single most important issue on Earth, and that it's, quote, critical for us and it's critical for our world that we address the issue. Climate change is not some hypothetical future event. It's something that has already happened and is continuing now and affects everyone and everything everywhere in Wyoming. Here in Lander, for example, average annual temperatures have already increased about 2.5 degrees Fahrenheit since records started being kept in the late 19th century. And that might not sound like much, but the effects are very real. It means, for one, more hot days. During the 20th century, we'd get an average of about 17 days every summer in Lander where temperatures reach 90 degrees or above. And these past 2 summers, we've averaged 44 days at 90 or above. We're getting less snow, and snow season is shorter. Peak runoff from snowmelt in our streams and waterways is happening earlier. Dry season is longer. For the first time in a long time, it wasn't cold enough this winter for Lander to open its outdoor skating rink in City Park. The towns of Rawlins and St. Clair actually ran out of water for a few days this March. Taps ran dry because their infrastructure wasn't suited to recent drought conditions. Huge swaths of pine forest in Yellowstone, the Absarokas, and the Wind River Mountains stand dead from pine beetle infestation because we have fewer very cold days a year. And last summer, as you probably know, Lander experienced impaired air quality from wildfire smoke for 43 days. Half the summer we lived under a visible haze, all of us and our children breathing that in. Climate change affects farmers and ranchers, hunters and anglers, builders and road workers, anybody who spends a lot of time outside, which is most of us in Wyoming. And it affects anybody who likes to breathe clean air and drink clean water, which is all of us. But these sorts of impacts are just beginning and will dramatically intensify as time goes on if we do not act immediately to mitigate their cause, which is the emission of heat-trapping gas from certain kinds of human activity. The good news is that we have a fair idea of how to do this and have much of the technology available to do so. It's just that we're not prioritizing the need to act now and collectively with speed and at scale. We need many more people working on this problem, actively contributing to the effort. Today's summit aims to promote that effort by increasing discussion of climate change in Wyoming, educating about current and projected future climate impacts to Wyoming and our region, inspiring action at the community level and beyond, highlighting traditional ecological knowledge and perspectives from our region's indigenous communities, helping the public understand what the major solutions to climate change look like, and providing opportunities to network and create connections among those concerned about climate change in Wyoming. We have a great show for you today, but before we start, just a few housekeeping items. So restrooms can be found in this direction by the entrance or through these doors back here. We have coffee and soft drinks at the table in this direction by the welcome tables. Please sign in at the front tables. Registration is really important for us. We will use this information to connect people living in the same areas of the state after the summit, so please remember to register. If you have a question or need to talk to someone who knows what's going on, look for a person wearing a yellow lanyard. They are the organizers. Those people are behind me on the stage, and they gave a lot of time to put this event together. They include the Lander Climate Action Network, LCAN, ILAW, the Indigenous Land Alliance of Wyoming, and other local climate action representatives from around the state. We have a packed program for you today, so please help us work hard to keep things on time, on schedule, and so we can fit everything in. And finally, as I'm sure you all know, COVID is an ongoing real concern, so please take personal precautions that fit your level of comfort and be aware of others. Free masks are available at the front tables if you would like. And we want to acknowledge we're exposing ourselves to some risk here because of COVID. But after having had to cancel this event several times because of COVID, we think it's worth doing it now because we believe there's also real risk in not making progress on climate change at this critical moment in time. And one final request is please do not use the Wi-Fi during our next presentation so that it doesn't interfere with our speaker. And with that, I will hand it to my fellow organizer, Bigwin. Welcome again.
Bahini sanana behin jihbi ne a nuhu usi hatanini jawa ani. Jabati hinan eti haticha and eti don. Hithati nahabatan hithati nakusach zombichu. Good morning. It's good to all see you here this morning. My Arapaho name is Wind River. Hasesi Nichia. I go by Big Wind. I use they them pronouns. I'm a two-spirit member of the Northern Arapaho tribe. And I'm going to be reading a land acknowledgement. Wyoming was created through the Fort Bridger and Fort Laramie treaties. It is home to both the Eastern Shoshone and Northern Arapaho who share the Wind River Reservation. Lander was once a part of the Wind River Reservation but was taken due to gold found in South Pass. By the time the first European settlers arrived in the area, there were around 13 different tribes that had an affinity to this land. Arapaho, Arikaraw, Bannock, Blackfeet, Cheyenne, Crow, Grovant, Kiowa, Nez Perce, Dakota, Lakota, Shoshone, and Ute. It is further a place of gathering, trade, and sustenance to over 47 distinct indigenous tribal nations. We recognize and reaffirm those historical and maintain connections to Wyoming's territories, relatives, and waterways. Furthermore, as an indigenous person, there are limitations to a land acknowledgement, and we hope this opens up a conversation to returning lands back to indigenous hands and restoring connections by indigenous stewardship and co-management implementation to public lands, state, and national parks. Thank you. And now I'm going to invite up Ivan Posey to do a blessing. Ivan Posey is a U.S. Army veteran. Worked for the Shoshone National Forest for over 10 years and father of 3 and also my grandpa. So I'd like to welcome up Ivan Posey.
Zambechu, Niaka. Like my grandson here, Big One, mentioned, I'm Ivan Posey, and I was asked to come and offer a blessing this morning. I wanted to thank him for doing the land acknowledgement this morning. You know, we are gathered here to talk about climate change, but I think, well, I know that indigenous values, indigenous teaching is something that we truly need, not only in this nation, but globally. We're in a changing times, but I think in our tribal communities, we remain the same. We adhere to our traditional teachings, our traditional customs, and some of that is taking care of the earth, taking care of each other. So I'm going to cedar this morning, and for those of you who don't know what I'm going to do here, I get my cedar from St. Canyon. As many of you that live around here know that this used to be part of the reservation through the 1868 treaty from here to South Pass. And once they found discovered gold in South Pass area, the government bought it from us for $25,000 in cattle. Um, in the 1890s, I don't think any of us were cattlemen or ranchers at that time, so I'm not too sure what happened to the cattle. But I always go up there at a certain place and gather my cedar. And when we gather cedar, um, we leave an offering there for taking that. And so this cedar is from Sinks Canyon up here, where I've been gathering for 35 years or so. So I'm gonna ask I'm going to go ahead and offer a prayer to our Dhamma Appa, what we call God, Creator, and we all pray to the same God. So help me out as I say my prayer, and then I'll go ahead and burn some cedar. If you feel comfortable coming up and blessing yourself like we do, please help yourself to do that. If you don't feel comfortable doing that, you don't have to. So help me out here. Dhamma Appa, we again approach you and thank you for this wonderful day you have blessed us with. We thank you for those who went before us, and we ask you to continue to be with those that are following behind us. We ask that you give us the strength, guidance, and direction we need in this life, in the short time we're here on our Mother Earth. We ask you to be with those who are continuing to help others, and those are who are going through tough times in this world. We ask you to remember our ancestors who left their teachings for us, and that we continue to teach those to our younger people also. We ask you always and thank you for the food that we receive, the health that we have, the relationship and the families that are in our lives. We know all good things come from you, and we are very thankful for that. We send you our love always through our Bhavi, Jesus, us. I was going to mention this is how modern we get. Years ago, we'd build a fire and get the charcoals and burn our cedar on there. Now we got charcoals we buy at Walmart.
Ho ho, Grandpa. Thank you for offering us a blessing. With that being done, I want to introduce you all to our first speaker, who's going to be joining us via Zoom. Dr. Redsteer is an internationally known climate change scientist, conservationist, and advocate for culturally competent science. As an assistant professor at the University of Washington, she teaches classes on environmental issues, climate change adaptation, and natural disasters. She previously led a 20-year career with the U.S. Geological Survey addressing environmental concerns on Native American tribal lands. Dr. Redsteer interleaves geomorphologic, climatologic, and ecologic data with investigations of land use history and policy in her research. She focuses on the consequences of global change as reflected by interactions of landscape processes, changing vegetation communities, and climate and their consequences for marginalized populations. By incorporating indigenous knowledge by tribal elders about the changes that they observed, her research elucidates the effects of increasing aridity in poorly monitored regions across the United States. This research communicates the relevance of ecosystem change to the livelihoods of those who are the most vulnerable. Dr. Redsteer is a Crow tribal member and is a recipient of the Oregon State University Distinguished Alumni Award, the Montana State University Extraordinary Women Award, Eugene Shoemaker Science Communication Award, and has received their PhD in geochemistry, a master's in earth sciences, and a bachelor's degree in geology. So if I could get a round of applause for Dr. Margaret Redsteer.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Big Wind. I wish I was there in person. And thank you, Ivan, for getting the meeting off and starting the meeting off in a good way. As we begin the Climate Summit today, it's fitting to think about how climate variability, weather extremes, and climate change might be experienced, understood, and interpreted by the communities and cultures that are living through it now. What changes are people observing, and what responses have they found to be appropriate? This in turn also raises the question of how do we ensure that climate change decision-making recognizes and supports local priorities and needs. To do this, we need to be aware of what's already being experienced on the ground. Without this understanding, decisions might not provide what's needed and could actually undermine the local resilience that is already prevalent in many indigenous and local rural communities. Uh-oh, why is this going forward? There we go. So, what I hope to convey today is that climate change is already underway and that immediate action is required to mitigate the worst effects. We're also going to have to adapt the changes that are now certain to come and are already underway. We can do this by using both conventional science, local knowledge, and indigenous knowledge, and together they are more powerful than they are separate. Conventional science provides us with global scale changes and averages. It helps us compare trends in isolated physical measurements and provides us with ways to model the temporal and spatial changes that are going to occur more broadly. But local knowledge also provides us with really critical information that can't be accounted for in conventional scientific data. There's just simply no way to include all of the things that happen to us locally that way. And indigenous resilience and traditional knowledge also provide really important contributions in seeking a path forward. These are some of the ways that climate change have been iconically portrayed to us. We look at the minimum sea ice extent here on the left-hand side of the slide that occurs in September each year, and this is a comparison between 1979 and 2007. This shows the significant changes that have already occurred in Arctic sea ice extent. And then on the right, we have a graph that shows global average temperature changes from 1880 to 2010, along with carbon dioxide concentration, which is one of the major greenhouse gases. If we were to include data up to 2022 today, we would be approaching 420 parts per million CO2, because the rate of the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere is accelerating. Part of the reason it's accelerating is we haven't addressed climate change the way we need to yet, and also because CO2 concentration the CO2 remains in the atmosphere for long periods of time. But what another thing that these images have done is they've made us think of things on average trends and geographically distant ways. But we know that climate change is occurring all around us in very distinctive ways that are very localized through decreasing snowfall. You've already heard some of the trends that are occurring globally. Increased use of water by plants, increased evaporation rates, more water in the atmosphere, which holds more, with more water vapors actually helps to increase the heat in the atmosphere. Bigger rainfall events that are more widely spaced apart, and changes in stream flow temperatures. All of these different things are happening at a local scale. And they're things that we need to think about when we think about how climate change will affect our communities. And all of these come back to how the climate is working to redistribute heat around the atmosphere to accommodate the warming temperatures. And this occurs through different atmospheric circulation systems. They're adjusting to the heat energy balances that are changing. So we have these cells here, which are actually not as evenly spaced as they're depicted here, but changing to accommodate warming temperatures. So Hadley circulation is expanding, and cold descending air here actually dictates where we have the world's deserts, and so desert regions are expanding. As the poles warm up, we get Arctic amplification, and this changes the way the jet stream behaves and the way storms move through the global system. And all of these have an effect on us. We also need to remember that as the climate warms, the atmosphere is coupled with the oceans, and the oceans are retaining a lot of the heat that is put into the climate system. And that changes the way ocean circulation occurs. And ocean circulation interacts with the atmosphere in the redistribution of heat and where we see different types of weather around the globe. And this happens because of temperature differences and salinity differences in the water, which are changing due to the polar ice caps melting. And this changes the volume of the water, and it changes the salinity of the water and the buoyancy of the water. And so we're seeing things like the circulation system in the northern Atlantic beginning to slow down. And this, of course, will lead to colder weather events, actually, in places like Great Britain that have always depended on the warm ocean waters that arrive at their shoreline. So there are lots of different ways that these things occur around us and change the climate system. And that's part of the reason that it is really important for us to act now, because as these things change, we can reach tipping points. And at high emission levels, we really don't know what we can expect. We truly can't model all of the different ways that things might change. And so the need to act is really paramount. And part of the reason I'm bringing all of this up is because there are places that are more sensitive to climate change impacts in mountainous regions, in the desert margins, and in low-lying island states. And these are homes of indigenous people around the world who have been living through and experiencing climate change. And have actually been adapting to climate change. And because there was so much attention given to the Arctic initially, it also helped scientists begin to understand how much indigenous people who live in the Arctic contribute to our understanding of ecosystem changes locally. And now, I think people are beginning to understand that that's true for indigenous people the world over. I've done a lot of my work on tribal lands in the southwestern United States. My in-laws are Navajo, so I have spent much of my adult life on the Navajo Nation. And so when I became a research scientist, I started my work there, and it has a particular climate. We get a lot of precipitation in the wintertime. It's separated by a dry and windy season in the spring, and then we get a summer monsoon from July through September. And these different seasonalities really come into play when we think about how climate change plays out in local communities. The other thing I was doing as a physical scientist is I studied wind erosion and rangeland health because I'm interested in grazing communities. And sand dunes cover a lot of the southwestern US that cover a great deal of the Great Plains. And so I was interested in rangeland health and how the atmospheric system and the Earth's surface system through geomorphology, how this shapes the landscapes around us, how that landscape changes, the way vegetation communities survive, and how those vegetation communities support grazing and livestock raising. And so I started to look at sand dunes because they're sensitive climate indicators, and their mobility and shape depends on the wind circulation and energy. And the vegetation that grows on them and protects them from wind erosion depends on soil moisture conditions, so how much moisture the plants have to survive, how much precipitation there is, how much temperature is leading to the use of the uptake of moisture from plants, and how much is just evaporating from the surface. And what I found was, not too surprising, that where large land-based tribes are located, there isn't really a whole lot of National Weather Service Station data. There's more precipitation data than there is temperature data, and there are big gaps in the records of what we can see. But we do know that there are regional trends, and a lot of times where the tribal communities and reservation communities are located, they're blank spaces. They're blank spaces, and it doesn't provide you with a lot of information about what the temperature changes were occurring, except in a few spots. So I'm really worried about how the density of data was affecting the way people understood what was happening to the rangeland. Because grazing can be a really contentious issue. And so when grazing conditions are significantly deteriorating, people tend to blame the people on the ground for not managing their land properly. And without having the climate information to compare, to understand what the processes are that are underway that might be dictating what's happening to the ecosystems, it's really hard to think about cause and effect if you don't have all of the information that you need. And that's when I began to think about what kinds of different knowledge we have and how different ways of knowledge can contribute to the conversation. And so conventional science is good at some things, and local knowledge is good at other things. And one of the things about Indigenous and local knowledge is it really is focused on living within the natural world and all of our relations to the ecosystems and the land and animals, all of the beings around us. The observations are over longer time scales because people have been living on the land generation after generation in subsistence lifestyles rather than discrete data sets. And it's based on practical experience. And it's gained attention with the advent of climate change, like I said, in the polar regions, but what about the other indigenous lands and other indigenous peoples, and what can they contribute? And that's when I began to think about what local knowledge can help me understand about climate changes and ecosystem changes on tribal lands. And so local and traditional knowledge provides us with a lot of information because people gather traditional medicines and they also look for dyes for basketry and weaving, for subsistence foods, hunting, and the changes in distribution and availability of these resources. People navigate using seasonal wind patterns in the Arctic. There's also river and coastal navigation, people hunting and fishing, as I said. We have astronomical observations and different types of constellations that are tied to animal migration times and harvests, seasons and calendars. All of these different things can provide us with information about the changes that are occurring because the people who are living on the land are keenly observant about all of the changes around them because they are tied to their survival and passed down from generation to generation. But I think one of the things that also gets missed a lot of times is that our social organizations and institutions and community know-how really play an important role in our resilience and have really shaped the way that people on the Navajo Nation have developed their climate change adaptation plan, which I will get to at the end here. So in doing my work, what I did starting in 2002, once I realized that I really needed more complete information about what was happening on the landscape, was I began to partner with Navajo communities, working with Clara Kelly and Harris Francis, to consult with tribal elders who are ceremonialists and botanists and renowned local knowledge keepers. And we conducted 105 interviews between 2002 and 2015. And this helped to spur the adaptation plan that then the Navajo Nation put into place just recently. It helped us to really, for me as a scientist and somebody who's lived in the community for many years, it helped me to understand and key in on specific changes that occurred as well, and come up with ways of gathering physical data sets that could contribute and align, or contribute and I would say add to the story so that both types of data sets, the conventional science and the local knowledge working together, really help us understand physical changes that are underway, people's land use changes that are underway, and how these things work together to help communities plan and adapt to climate change. So I want to underscore here that this was targeted at adaptation needs in the community. It wasn't about gathering information from elders to put into a scientific study. This was about helping people come up with plans to adapt to the changes that were underway and what we can expect to continue. And what we found from our observations with elders were that their observations did very closely align with the physical data records that we did have, and that every elder remarked about the changes in rain and snowfall. The snowfall changes were precipitous over the 20th century from 1930s when the snowfall records were began. And this is important because as the dialogue was about grazing, it becomes pretty evident that sheep and cattle don't do anything to change the rate of snowfall. A lot of what we see in the climate data actually shows that the climate has a much more pronounced effect on people's ability to use the land in their livelihoods. And so I think a lot of people are beginning to understand that their observations taken together are more powerful. They help acknowledge the observations that people have and acknowledge the change and the challenges that they face. And it also, as I mentioned, brings me back to thinking about what kind of data sets are important and what I should be measuring, because people talked about water availability quite a bit. And what we see is when we look back at the Navajo Nation and look at streamflow records and scientific records throughout the 20th century, is the physical change in water availability in stream flow. So what you see in yellow here is where perennial streams were flowing all year at the early part of the 20th century. By the middle of the 20th century, there was another water resource report by the USGS that shows perennial stream flow in green. And then the black line that is pointed to with the red arrow on the left here is where we have perennial stream flow today. And a lot of these areas have not had any kind of water resource management and groundwater withdrawal. So this has had a big effect on water availability to water livestock, for farming, and for just subsistence living. The other thing about the observations from tribal elders is they provided information about how people have changed their livelihoods and what they've had to do to adjust to the changes. And they've also provided me with information that really helps me understand what kinds of seasonal changes are occurring that lead to ecosystem changes and some of our vulnerabilities. And one of the really important ones was soil moisture observations. And part of the reason the soil moisture observations are so important is that we have in the Southwest a dry windy spring. And this leads to a lot of sand and dust storms. But if you have a colder winter and more moisture on the ground, that moisture can be retained in the subsurface until the monsoon season arrives and provide moisture for plants. But the problem is that moisture has diminished over time. So these are the kinds of critical information that people can supply just because they have been living on the land and they're observing things day to day because of their day-to-day subsistence practices. And this includes, migration patterns of animals, what animals are around, where they're found. Same with trees. Cottonwood trees have all but disappeared, as have willows and other ceremonial medicinal plants. And people have to go farther to find them. And there are new plants with no Navajo names. These are really important pieces of information that help guide us forward And of course, they're very serious changes, but they also help to inform the way we think about what we need to do. So taking these things together really provide us insights on physical processes that are underway, what kind of physical data sets need to be gathered, but they also provide real important evidence and characterization of changes and the challenges that people are facing. And that helps to focus people and think about what their vision of the future would be and how they would want to put together an adaptation plan that helps to minimize the impacts that people are feeling. And this is really important. One of the really, I think, interesting ways that the Navajo Nation has put together their adaptation plan is that they have, they did a survey of all the school children, and what the school children found were their biggest concerns and what the school children wanted to see for their future. Because one of the really big challenges is how do we keep young people living and thriving on reservation lands, because many of them feel the need to leave the reservation. And in fact, my family is now living in the Pacific Northwest because it has become so difficult to live on reservation lands because they just can't support subsistence practices the way they have in the past. So how do we deal with that? How do we make a future for young people on the reservations? I thought I deleted this slide, but this is just another example of how I've looked at long-term changes, how short changes have been, how short changes don't really tell you what's going on over the long term. And it really did influence the way I've done my work by staying in the landscape and measuring from season to season. So when we think about assessing climate change impacts, the scientific method is about observations and questions. And those observations and questions can come from the people who are experiencing climate change on the ground. Most science today, really, that gets published in journal is based on what instruments can measure precisely and discretely over short time frames. And this leaves out a lot of the questions that are related to today's challenges. So we need to think about how local knowledge can enhance our understanding of vulnerabilities and the consequences of our adaptation actions. Do we take the right actions? Are they the actions that are going to help build the resilience and the future that our younger generations need so that our families can remain together on the lands that we love? And traditional ecological knowledge and local knowledge can inform our planning. It helps engage communities in science partnerships. When people see that their own observations are being acknowledged and that their own observations aren't just something that a fluke that they happen to see, but that a lot of other people are seeing the same thing too, that is really, really a powerful thing. So it was really, when we brought together all the information from observations of elder, it was a little bit like a Me Too moment, because people started to see that they weren't alone in their concerns and in the changes that they were noting. And so I think the scientific community also has to acknowledge that not all of the changes can be truly represented in models, that the scale is unlikely to capture the things that are localized and of concern to local communities. And I want to underscore also that this kind of work needs to recognize the community needs and the exposures that are also the result of historical land use and land tenure. We are living in a colonized society where reservations are limited in size, where the mobility of people on the landscape has been limited, and where a lot of the financial capital is not in our hands. And so we need to work together to think about not just what local knowledge can do to inform conventional data, but how these different data sets work together so that we can address what the needs are in the local communities. It should be focused on those needs. But we need to recognize that some places may not be the best places for government buildings and for our reservation boundaries to be established. We have, tribal agencies located in places that were great for grazing and for the cavalry and the War Department to keep their livestock, fed and watered. But these are also now flood-prone areas. And we also need to quit blaming ourselves and start thinking about what those impacts to the communities mean and how do we help the communities adapt in a way that is useful and important to maintain the resilience that we have, because there's nobody more resilient than a tribal community. Tribal communities have already been upended by many, many big changes. And so that resilience and that strength is there. And we need to build on it and recognize it and move forward with it. So thank you for your time.
We have time for 2 questions from the audience. Does anyone have any questions? I think we have a mic runner, so there you go.
Hello, thank you very much for that interesting perspective. Can you tell us a little bit more what the students are saying that they need and want, the results of your research so far with the young people?
There's a little bit of an echo. Could somebody repeat that for me?
You want to repeat that inside?
I can try again. I'm interested in your research with the young people in the schools on the reservation and what they are telling you about what they need and want. I wonder if you can give us some information about your findings with the young people. Could you hear me that time? Students, yeah, what the students are saying. You said you were doing research with the students about what they need to go into the future, and I wondered if you could tell us what they're telling you. I'm sorry, my voice is not sorry.
Okay, well, to be quite honest, I work with a lot of youth that aren't engaged in school, and either they've graduated from high school or they've dropped out, and they're not necessarily in college. And a lot of them have been actually frustrated a little bit by tribal leaders, and so they have worked with me locally on, I would call them, I guess, community engaged projects where we work to help slow down wind erosion and reseed grazing areas, and work to promote I guess, mitigate surface erosion in ways that can help enhance grazing and just help people on the ground with some of the physical problems they have. For example, a number of houses have been threatened by moving sand dunes, and so we've worked in those areas to try to slow the movement of sand dunes down so that people can remain in their homes. But a lot of the data that I have collected actually has been incorporated into a climate change adaptation plan that the tribal government is now putting in place that is thinking about different ways of providing support to people who are still farming in their communities. They're more communal farming. Initiatives going on, although a lot of that has slowed down because of COVID. Obviously, COVID has had a big impact on all of this. But really, the main concern that came out of the questionnaires that the Navajo Nation Department of Fish and Wildlife instituted across the reservation high schools and grade schools was the worry over drought and desertification. That came out to be the #1 issue. Secondary issue, which is now becoming the primary issue of the Navajo Nation, is water security, water quality and water security, because the water resources have declined so significantly. So that has become another really big driving issue. And of course, what we see happening on the Colorado River at Lake Powell and Lake Mead is also concerning because of diminishing hydroelectric power. And even though there have been coal-fired power plants on the Navajo Nation, Navajo Tribal Utility Authority gets all of its power from the hydropower at Lake Canyon Dam. So there's a lot of people living on the reservation who still don't have access to water, who haul water from farther and farther away. And there are people who don't have electricity in their homes. And I guess one of the other things I would mention too, and this is, I'm digressing, I know, is that part of the way we've been adjusting to climate change is through mainstreaming, like putting in climate change adaptation planning into existing programs and programs that are funded, but there are funding gaps. And one of the big gaps is in housing. And having housing that is able to provide a safe place for people to be in the heat events that we're seeing. And how do people deal with the heat when they're still hauling water and don't have electricity? So those are some of the concerns that we still see going forward. And the youth are right in there. They're the ones who are out on the land doing community projects and working in their communities. And a lot of them, frankly, are not in school anymore. They're developing projects and getting funding for projects and organizing nonprofits.
Well, we want to thank you, Dr. Redsteer. That's all the time we have for questions, and we're going to be moving on. So if I can get an additional round of applause for Dr. Redsteer.